Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining at our monthly CEO briefing. I'm delighted that I don't have to do all the work this morning. We've got Adam Marshall, who's the Director General of BCC, joining us to talk us through the huge amount of work that BCC have been doing in the last few months. I was just reflecting that Adam and I took over roughly the same time. You became Director General when I took over as Chief Exec at the Chamber, so we've been tracking each other over the last 4 years. And I have to say, Adam has just brought this huge amount of energy and vigour to BCC. As we were just chatting earlier, I have no idea how he fits it all in. I've actually now switched off my BCC WhatsApp group alert because, messages ping in from 6 in the morning till midnight, and that continues through the weekend. So that's exactly how Adam fits so much into a day, is that the day just gets longer and longer. But you actually have totally transformed the BCC network. It's a really engaged, close community, and I think the connections that he's brought into the UK government makes us a chamber network that's probably the most listened to and respected business organisation group in the UK. Just for a bit of background, there's about 53 accredited chambers in the BCC network, representing, I think, about 100,000 businesses and around about 3 million employees, or 6 million employees. So quite a voice, and collectively that makes sure that we really gather the impact this is having on businesses to really understand how the business community is being affected, and feeding this into BEIS, the Treasury, even into number 10, ensure that government really understand what businesses are facing. And I think it's been really helpful in shaping the business support packages that have come out from the Chancellor in recent months. And, even when the packages were out, Adam was there probing for the gaps, seeking clarification, just making sure that all businesses that needed that support, or as many businesses as possible, could access that absolute necessary support. And I think as the months have gone on, this work will need to continue, because it looks like it's going to be a much longer and slower recovery. So I know, Adam, you've got packed day, so you're going to go first and going to speak about the work of the BCC, and then Joe and I will give a bit of an update after Adam, and then we thought we would keep the Q&A right to the very end, and hopefully have a bit more of a discussion. We're expecting up to about 30 people joining the call, so we should be able to manage putting your hands up and bringing you in to ask a question and getting engaged if you want to make a comment. If you want to, though, you can put your question to Adam or myself and Joe through the chat button, and we can read that out on your behalf for you. So I'm going to hand over to Adam now, and then I'll give you a more local update later on. Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, Adam.
Liz, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm joining you from my box room in southwest London, not the BCC's offices, but we've been here for about 2 months working remotely at the moment, and as Liz says, as a chamber network, I think we've come together like we never have before to try to do everything we can for business communities around the UK. I just wanted to note before I start that my colleague James Martin is also on the call with us this morning. James has just started with the BCC working on our policy this week. So he's had a remote start, and this is one of his very first chamber visits. So I'm delighted that James can be with us and also hear a bit from you as well, because one of the things that's most important from us isn't talking at you, it's listening to you and understanding what the concerns are facing each business community and how we then reflect those back in the best possible way. So what have we done over the past few months, apart from working every hour that the day brings, as Liz mentioned before? Several things. First of all, we've been really involved in the design and the improvement of the various support schemes that government has brought forward for business. We were in conversations with the Chancellor, with the Business Secretary, and with others very early doors, just as it became apparent what the scale of the impact would be. And when you look at the furlough scheme, when you look at the loan schemes, and when you look at the grant schemes, announced by the UK government and then mirrored to a significant extent by the devolved administrations. You know, a lot of that bears the imprint of the chamber network and the feedback that we were collecting in real time from across the 53 around the UK. The other thing that I think really bears remembering is that when you have told us things throughout this process and we've brought them forward to government, some of the changes to the schemes that we've seen are the result of that. So them saying that we're going to extend the furlough scheme, that's a result of all of the intelligence we were able to bring forward. Them saying that it could be made more flexible and you could bring someone back part-time in return for a shift in the contribution balance. Again, that's something we've had a huge influence on. Extending support for retail and hospitality and tourism businesses. Again, something where we've noted the particular impact on places, and that's had a response from government. And then sometimes it's been using examples from other parts of the UK in order to try to club the UK government over the head a bit as well. So I think Scotland's done the right thing in terms of its airports, for example, in terms of trying to reduce the burden on airports from business rates, whereas that's not been taken up elsewhere in the UK. So we use examples that come up from the devolved nations as well to try to help us get the right policies in place UK-wide. In addition to the financial support schemes, we've been heavily involved in this effort to provide back-to-work guidance. You'll have seen the stuff that's been published by the Business Secretary and others around back to work from BEIS. Obviously, you're awaiting, I think, today, the First Minister coming forward and setting out the Scottish Government's guidance as well about what the sort of back to work area will look like. And at every point in time, we have been able to bring forward what chamber members have been telling us about their practical concerns. So taking the lessons from those businesses that were able to remain open through the crisis, applying them so that others could learn from them, but also at the same time, bringing up the practicalities that civil servants in Whitehall would never have thought of. You know, things as mundane as how do you deal with lifts in office buildings? You know, how do you change cleaning regimes? You know, how do you reduce contact on public transport? What's the interaction between childcare and education and people's ability to go back into the workplace? All of this is the evidence that we've been able to sort of bring into the conversation and affect the way that they've been trying to encourage businesses back to work. I mean, we've also brought another pretty valuable perspective into the mix as well, which is an international one. One thing Liz didn't mention in her introduction is we now have 60 British chambers as part of our network in countries all around the world. And many of you may have had some engagement with those over time. And those in Hong Kong, Singapore, China, and Korea have been enormously helpful to us because they're about 2 months ahead of where we are in terms of dealing with the virus and in terms of dealing with the challenges to business. So we've been able to bring in the lessons from some of those countries as well in order to try to bring those to bear on UK government policy and also in terms of business practice here. And, you know, talking to my colleague Steve Lynch, who runs the British Chamber in Beijing, for example, we got a huge amount of insight that we were able to bring in and continue those discussions with UK government as well. Some of what has been done in China has been absolutely astounding, not necessarily easy to do here, but where there are lessons we can bring forward, we've tried to do that. In terms of where we see things now, you know, obviously, I think we're in a bit of a calm before the storm. You know, we've been through the first wave of the storm. We might be in the eye of it temporarily at the moment, but the second wave of it will be pretty intense. What we're seeing from all of the statistics we collect around the UK, our business impacts tracker, we call it, is that the situation's not worsening week by week as it was for so many businesses. It's sort of flattened out. Activity levels are low for a lot of firms, but it's flattened out. So we're not seeing continued decline, which is helpful. That being said, we don't know exactly what sort of scope we're going to see for a fast recovery or a slow recovery as we start to reopen and reemerge out of lockdown. A lot of people have put forward a number of different letters to describe what it could look like, whether it's a V-shaped, a U-shaped, an L-shaped, or a W-shaped recovery. I think anyone who tells you they know what the answer is to that is selling you a bit of snake oil at this particular point in time, because none of us know really what it's going to look like. What we can see, though, is that certain businesses and certain sectors are looking like activity will restart successfully more quickly than others. We may see a bit of an upsurge. So in some parts of manufacturing and construction, we may see improvements. But you're not going to see that, for example, in civil aerospace and aviation, with the news from Rolls-Royce, for example, yesterday, and many others besides, because of structural and systemic changes in some of those businesses. So the recovery is going to be a long haul, I think. And I think we're looking at a couple of years of incremental progress where we may see some moves forward and some moves backward as well. Because we still don't know whether we're going to face significant second waves and whether the adaptations that we've had to date will be enough for us to overcome some of them. So we're keeping a close eye on that. And right now we've gone out with the quarterly economic survey, which I'm sure many of you participate in every quarter, the biggest private business survey in the UK, particularly important this time around because the Bank of England governor wants to know what we're finding. All of the MPC members want to know, the Treasury wants to know, and the level of engagement, the level of asks we're having right now for real world intelligence from our business communities is really higher than it's ever been before. So we're relevant. We are considered as a chamber network to be constructive, and we bring the information in from the bottom up rather than the top down, and that I think is where we're seen to have a great strength. Looking ahead, we're sort of focusing our work around three things. We call it restart, rebuild, and renew. And our president, Baroness Ruby Smith, is leading some of this work and is heavily involved in it. But we're trying to get the conditions right so we know what's needed to restart various parts of the economy. Then look into the sort of next 1 to 3 years, what changes, incentives, etc., are going to be needed in order to rebuild. And then when we talk about renew, the question is, how do we get to a future where we take the lessons that we've had from this crisis and use them effectively in order to invest flexibly for the future? From our perspective, the worst outcome we could have for our business communities is if, in response to this crisis and the huge amount of additional expenditure that's been required, if we were to see austerity coupled with tax rises on businesses and individuals, that would be a very bad outcome in the short term because it will just depress the economy completely. So we've said we're going to need to see continued strong spending by government. We're going to also need to see taxes kept at a reasonable level for a period of time to enable both businesses and individuals to bring demand back up in the economy. Now, that's not an orthodox position. That's a position trying to respond to what we see going on right now. And it probably isn't one that we would have had a few years ago, but we think it's going to be necessary in order to plot a sustainable path out of all of this. And what we'll be doing over the coming months is working with chamber business communities all around the country and saying, okay, as we look to rebuild and renew, what are the things that you think need to happen? We know that everyone is concerned about infrastructure and making sure that infrastructure projects go ahead when they've been planned. We know everyone is thinking about retraining and what we need to do with the workforce because we're going to have a very significant number of redundancies and a significant number of unemployed people who are going to need retraining in order to come back into the system. We know everyone's going to be concerned about how do you recapitalize businesses as well, because there's going to be a lot of unsustainable debt in many businesses around the country too. So we know what some of the big issues are, and we want to open up that big conversation over the coming months and make sure that it's chambers that are seen as the organization providing constructive and effective solutions. So Liz, it's a pleasure to be with you. I won't talk any longer because for me, it's hearing from colleagues that is the huge benefit to the work that we're trying to do on all your behalf. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Adam. I almost now don't want to sort of waste any time speaking myself, as I think people will want to ask some questions and get involved. But I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just kind of giving more of a local context as well, just running through what's happening in the city and how we're approaching recovery planning for Edinburgh. And there's quite a lot of work being done on this already. Apologies if I'm repeating myself for the people who joined the Andrew Care webinar on Tuesday. If you missed it, it was really, really useful. So let us know and we can send you a link. It was recorded, so we can send you a link to the recorded webinar to find out sort of the much bigger picture about what the city's doing in terms of recovery planning. But I guess kind of a couple of points to make about what's happening in the city. Edinburgh's enjoyed the benefits of tourism probably more than many cities. Until recently, it was the second most visited city in the UK, second to London. So conversely, we're more likely to be impacted more than most by the decimation of the tourism sector, which is likely to be one of the last sectors to reopen. It's estimated that Edinburgh's lost about £1 billion worth of revenue and 18,500 jobs in that sector alone in the last 3 months. So that's huge, and the ripple effect of that will be well felt. 44% of jobs in the city are dependent on tourism, compared with about 23% in the rest of Scotland. So, that's going to take some time to come back from. And it's a sector that's all been shut down. Edinburgh Airport has gone from about 18 million passengers a year. They're estimating probably less than 5 million. And we've been speaking to a number of bus and train companies. They're all running at about 7.5% capacity. So they've taken a big hit alongside the bars, restaurants and hotels. So all wondering, when are they going to be reopening, whilst kind of following the guidelines on safety and social distancing. It's not been helped by the closure of the summer festivals, the Royal Highland Show. I think there were some businesses kind of early days thinking that things might have returned near to normal by the summer. We now know that that's highly unlikely, and it's probably well into the tail end of this year, if not into Q1, before we start seeing some movement. Just looking at some of the other bigger sectors in the city, education, speaking to the universities, I mean, they've been severely impacted. University of Edinburgh particularly, I think about 25% of their students are international. So they're feeling a huge impact with the loss of international students, and also with the social distancing requirements. So they're mostly looking at online, they're gearing up for online study, and unsure when they will start campus education again. But again, the knock-on effect of that to the city will be huge. Something like 20% of the population is made up of students. So we're gonna miss having them around. And again, the impact on the workforce. Skills Development Scotland suggests that 21% of the workforce has been furloughed, with 66% of businesses making use of the furlough scheme. So the big question is, how many of those people will return to work? It suggests that 920,000 jobs could be at risk in Scotland, with Edinburgh's figure potentially as high as 120,000. So we're going from a city of almost full employment, just 2.9% unemployment, to 7.9% in 3 months. We've seen 500% increase in universal credit claims. And sadly, it's the under 25s and females who are 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed. So as Adam says, this reskilling, retraining, and moving people possibly from one sector into another is hugely important, that we need to address as a city. And as Andrew Keir mentioned on Tuesday, this will not be, in his view, this will not be a quick bounce back. He sees it as a long, slow recovery. So I think we do need to prepare ourselves that it's not going to be all roses again by the end of the year. And how we bounce back and how quickly that might be, I suppose, really depends on getting businesses back up and running so that we can minimise the permanent business closure and protect as many jobs as possible. But again, this relies on government policy, continued business support, and of course businesses adapting very much to what the new normal will be in terms of new business models, how we embrace sort of digital transformation and just look at new ways of working. So as I say, the City Council is doing quite a lot of work on this. I think we've been a bit critical because it's really hard to get the communication out, and I think people are really, really hungry to know what's happening and how they can start preparing their businesses for recovery and what steps they need to be making. So I'm going to hand over to Jo. She's going to give a little bit more detail around the different work streams, what work's been done around capital investment projects, skills and employability, and particularly the tourism and culture sectors. So once Jo's given a sort of a quick overview, let's open up to a discussion, some Q&A, and make the most of having Adam with us this morning. Thanks. Over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Liz. Morning, everyone. As Liz said, I'm going to attempt to give an overview at a City Council level in terms of, so I think Liz has set the picture in terms of where the city is at, and I'm going to attempt to give a bit of an overview of what the plan is, focusing specifically on some of the work that's being done around tourism and hospitality, obviously given the importance of that sector to the city economy as Liz has outlined. So firstly, Andrew, as Liz said, updated us on Wednesday. He advised that the council have now paid out about £73 million in grants across the city on all the various grant schemes that they administer. I think they admit there was a bit of a slow start on some of that. I think the second round of particularly the Small Business Support Fund for retailers and hospitalities, where they were able to access additional funding, has been much quicker because that was all done online, whereas the initial element of that was done on paper. But they are making good time on that and starting to pay those, or a significant amount of those have been paid out. The focus now is on looking at the self-employed support piece and getting that moving at pace. The council has 18,000 staff. They have 8,000 of them working from home, and Andrew was at pains to say that the vast majority of council operations are still running, not to full capacity in some areas, because obviously resources had to be diverted to emergency areas such as food provision and supporting the most vulnerable in the city. But the message is the council is still open for business and still keen to support the business sector as much as possible. The council have pulled a recovery plan together. There are 5 work streams in that plan at the moment. So the first is public health and health advice, and again Andrew was at pains to say that is the driving piece here. That group will drive everything in terms of messaging and pace and shape of restart and recovery. They have one focused on council service operations, looking at the new normal. What will restart look like? How can they get things back up to speed again where they've had to reduce back a bit? They have produced a number of scenario plans together, and Andrew again was at pains to say that they've scenario planned for every eventuality. So that's where a lot of their focus has been. They are also the third work stream is looking at internal working practices in terms of people and finance. Again, he was very open and said that in 3 months the council have lost £70 million worth of revenue. Something like Edinburgh Leisure, for example, because the gyms and things are closed, is losing about £440,000 a week in terms of lost revenue. So again, he was at pains to say the impact on local authority finances will be very significant. The Scottish Government has funded, I think, 30% so far, committed to funding 30% of the of what has been needed. So they're working very closely with Scottish Government to try to close some of that gap. The fourth work stream is sustainable economic recovery, and I'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail. And the fifth is life chances, so looking at school returns, vulnerable citizens, homelessness, and that kind of thing. He also did say that the much discussed and much delayed city vision piece that should have been announced in March time, they're now getting ready to come out with that now and publish that. I think they've identified the key principles of that are still there. Perhaps the roadmap to getting there is changing now, but the principles are there and so ready to be shared with the city. In terms of the economic development piece, because obviously that's the most important piece, I think what he had said was we're not going to return to what it was like before, and this gives us an opportunity to actually think about what we want it to look like now. So that's going to be a big part of the rebuild and renew conversation. They want to build much more resilience into the local economy. Sustainability is at the heart of that economic recovery plan. I know it was before. If anything, it's even more important now than it was. So looking at inclusion, looking at climate, looking at reducing poverty, which is a big issue in our city in terms of real economic divide. And they want to look at a number of things to deliver those. So they're looking at capital investment in infrastructure. So they're looking at the tram development, the Granton development, west of Edinburgh development, and all the various developments that have kind of been halted. And for the moment, they want to get those up and running as quickly as possible to try and drive that investment in infrastructure that the city so desperately needs. They want to look at employability and skills as a specific area, and Adam and Liz have both touched on the impact on employment, and particularly for younger people. So looking at skills gaps in key sectors. They are looking at using some of the city, potentially using some of the city deal money, so the 25 million that was set aside for the skills piece, to try to drive that agenda forward and to repurpose some of that somehow to look at the immediate issue and the immediate need. They're not losing sight of the fact that in amongst all of this, and I applaud Adam for not actually mentioning this, but Brexit still looms and hasn't gone away. So they're conscious that obviously the plan needs to take cognizance of what may happen there and how that may impact in the middle of all of this if there's no delay. Looking at future-proofing skills and sustainability, because again, longer term, I think this has taught us all a bit of a lesson in terms of that resilience piece, and so they're focusing on that. Looking at Business Gateway to provide additional support and enhancing the support that's available there. Rebooting the festivals and culture piece, and Liz mentioned that as a particular sector that's obviously impacted on the city. So Liz sits on the strategic implementation group who oversee the tourism in the city. It's chaired by Adam McAreavey, the leader of the City Council. And they have asked ETAG, the Edinburgh Tourism Action Group that I sit on, to pull a plan together to look specifically at that issue, and they have done that. That plan has just been approved. I'll come on to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there is a plan there in terms of that particular sector to get that back up and running as quickly as possible. And the council lastly are looking at regulation as levers to recovery and not barriers. So they are very conscious of trying to remove as many barriers as possible through the regulatory piece. So looking at planning and procurement and supporting localities. So that's a kind of really sort of broad brush overview. In terms of the tourism plan that I mentioned, again, the focus on that is they've pulled a plan together which is focused on reboot, recovery and resilience. So that's looking both short term at the immediate reboots and how do we get that sector back up and running as quickly as possible, and also longer term in terms of full recovery. And they've pulled 5 short working life groups together to try to focus on that. The big thing there, I won't go into tremendous amount of detail because I'm very conscious of time, but the big thing there is that they want to adopt a Team Edinburgh approach. So they're very much focused on building a collaborative group within the city to drive that forward, putting out some key messages, trying to make that emotional connection. So looking at both domestic markets and international markets so that when they are ready to be opened up, they know that Edinburgh is waiting and welcoming them. So they're looking at a few things. They're looking at developing a campaign around that. They're looking at building social media and communications. They're looking at data analytics. So they've got some funding through the data-driven innovation team to look at data and stats around that to help drive messaging and drive longer-term planning. They're looking at PR and stakeholder engagement, which we are going to be particularly getting involved in. So we'll be obviously out speaking to you all and hoping to get you involved and engaged as much as possible in that. And lastly, they're looking at business tourism as well, which obviously will have taken a real hit, and who knows what the future of that may look like moving forward. So that's very whistle stop, and hopefully that covers most things. But like any questions anyone has throughout the discussion, please just shout.
Thank you very much, Jo. Okay, I'm sure people would want to come in. Please share your own experiences. Please ask some questions of Adam now we've got him with us. And just let's try and have a good discussion this morning. Anybody want to come in? Either raise your hand or... oh, Donald, I knew you'd come in. Do you want to unmute yourself, Donald?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a really helpful briefing, and can I commend the work that's been done by the Chambers of Commerce, local and national level, and actually by the government in terms of putting huge resources into tackling what's an unprecedented crisis. There are two things, I think, for me that are very important. One is, in practical terms, how do the public agencies and the government respond to all this in giving practical support? Because I hear everything that's being said about the council tackling inclusion and poverty and issues like that. The way you do that is to get people into work, and that's what we had in Edinburgh before this hit in. We had a very successful and strong city economy that actually had relatively low levels of poverty, albeit there is relative poverty. That you will never be able to remove relative poverty, but we had high levels of employment, high levels of income generation, and generally a very prosperous city. We need to try and get back to that as quickly as possible. So what are the schemes that are going to be done? And if you're looking at ways to help businesses, perhaps one of the best ways might be to look at how businesses might take on employees earlier than they would otherwise be able to once the recovery begins to kick in and once tourism businesses begin to open up. So that's one issue. What can we do practically in those terms? The second one is the political debate that we have in Edinburgh. We're all aware that there's been a significant backlash by a minority of the population against the tourism industry, despite all the benefits that brings to Edinburgh. How do we respond to that? Is the council aware, and is the council trying to change the narrative in terms of tourism businesses? You only have to look at what the hospitality industry has been saying over the past day or two to see exactly what we could potentially lose in terms of restaurants, capacity in theatres, the fringe itself being on the brink of, and I don't think it will happen, but being on the brink of a financial abyss. How do we change that narrative? So it's those two issues. What do we do practically and what do we do politically to move the discussion forward? Adam,
do you want to pick up the first one as a sort of general, what you see as support, practical support for businesses? I've got a couple of views on that, but if you kick off on the first bit, and I can probably pick up that political debate issue around tourism in the city.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Donald. I think there are a couple of things that I would say about this. The first is to try to understand what is it that would help businesses take on employees once we see the first labour market effects of the crisis. So we're going to see some redundancies. There's no question we're going to see some significant redundancies even as we come off the furlough scheme. Some sectors will see that more than others, etc. But how do we actually help businesses take people on and have the confidence to take people on thereafter? We may need to be looking at things like national insurance holidays again and various other things that lower the cost of employment and lower the barriers to taking people on again, because I think a lot of businesses will be very happy to run at a reduced level of employment for a significant period of time unless they see their revenue streams coming back. So there need to be some incentives built into the system. But that's a helpful one for us to ponder, and maybe James and I can take that away and think about it a little bit. In terms of public agencies, I think the biggest problem we've got at the moment is that the various public agencies that exist, whether that's at local or national level, aren't particularly joined up, and they're doing very different things in very different ways often. And I've got a concern on several levels. One is we obviously have divergence between some of the devolved administrations and the UK government on how we move ahead, and that's affecting businesses in terms of confusion and cost. But then the other is, how do we make sure that if you've got a UK blueprint, a Scotland blueprint, and a city blueprint, how do we make sure that those all fit together and they're not working at cross purposes? And that's an eternal problem of us in the private sector trying to deal with governments. But I think it's all the more important that we get as much alignment as we can going forward now, because otherwise a lot of businesses will simply say, I'm going to wait it out and see what happens before I really take some risks again.
Thanks, Adam. And I guess I would add that businesses are just desperate for some visibility. I know we're waiting for the roadmap, but just to see what the scenarios are, what the likely time plan, when sectors are starting to come back, how they can start adapting to what this new normal might be. I think there's still this sort of fog of uncertainty at the moment, and I think people are frustrated. They want to get back. So I think as much as we can as a chamber, trying to make sense of what planning and recovery plans are being developed, we need to make sure that businesses are accessing that. So you want to come back in, Adam?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to that and say, actually, there may be a silver lining of opportunity for places like Edinburgh in some of this, because it's very likely that we're not going to see a lot of international travel and tourism, but there are noises coming out of various parts of government that domestic travel and tourism may be allowed in the near future. It may be the case that that happens in time to salvage some of the summer season for destinations like Edinburgh. The question is, are the businesses able to react quickly enough if that demand is unleashed? And if it is the case that one could travel within the UK for breaks and for holidays this year, will the businesses be ready in order to be able to accommodate those? Will the government at devolved level also be willing to see that level of tourism returning from other parts of the UK?
And I was going to kind of pick that up with the, the hot potato of over tourism that you mentioned, Donald. I mean, interestingly, literally a couple of weeks before lockdown, I was sitting on the SIG, the Strategic Implementation Group for Tourism, where there was a kind of hot debate around whether we should actively promote the city or whether it was about managing tourism. And there was this feeling, well, we're going to have 3.8% growth year on year for the next 10 years with tourism. So we actually don't really need to do anything. That's a 30% growth over the next 10 years. So let's not do anything and let's just manage it and make sure that businesses, it's a sustainable, inclusive sector. And literally 2 weeks later, the airport shut down, everything's shut down. And we are now, I think it's been a wake-up call. And I think timing-wise, they disbanded Marketing Edinburgh just at the point where we need a city destination marketing function. So I think we do need to think about how do we promote the city, and largely really to the domestic market. But I think, as Adam said, the big issue is we cannot market the city if there's no businesses open. And I think there are kind of key sectors of that hospitality industry that need to open. For example, if the castle doesn't open, then no one else is going to open. So it's that sequencing of how we kind of restart the sector, because there's no point in bringing people here if there's nothing to do when they get here. So I think that, this is what SIG and ETAG are addressing, is how do we kind of restart the memories and remind people of the wonderful times they've had, so we bring them back to the city, but making sure that they then have a good experience when they get there. So I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done. Thanks very much, Donald. Anybody else want to come in? Brendan? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Morning. Thank you for that, Liz. So Brendan Dick, Chair of Open Weeks in Scotland. So not going to talk about tourism, but the thing I did want to pick up on and really welcome others' views. One of the biggest challenges we have with all my 3,200 people in Scotland being key workers, most of them field engineers doing their jobs, it is the divergence of guidance between the four governments of the UK. And it's been quite interesting. I think for any of us who work for British organisations, COVID has helpfully, in my opinion, highlighted to colleagues in London who maybe live in a bit of an ivory tower. I'm sure Adam doesn't do that. That we are working with four governments under this situation. It's not one government and the others follow, and clearly they don't. So we are working pretty hard, mostly successfully, and to be fair, very collaborative with civil servants, both in the UK government and the Scottish government, to try and make sense virtually on a daily basis of how you keep your workers and employees, A, working safe, and B, working safely with members of the public when they get confused about the guidance. Yeah. And I include employees. So I have sometimes engineers will say, well, I know Boris has said X, but that doesn't apply in Scotland. And quite often they're right. So it's quite a challenge. And I guess that one of the things we found just talking to both London-based and Scottish civil servants, and in fact in Ireland as well, Northern Ireland, and I'd welcome Adam's views if he wants to say it, one of the things that is not working well is communication from London civil servants with the devolved nation civil servants before things get announced. So you find that the civil servants in the devolved nations are often reacting to things that London say, trying to catch up, which doesn't help us either in industry. So that's I guess my ask at a British level, to see whether British chambers can help try and make that dialogue between the governments just better, so that we're not all playing catch up, which we are quite a lot of doing.
Yeah. Brendan, I completely recognise that, and I also recognise all of the political sensitivities that come with it. What we've tried to say is that business communities understand divergence between the nations, or indeed within them, if there's a very specific public health reason why there needs to be that divergence. Otherwise, we ask the question, is this divergence political? And I'm not trying to ascribe fault to one party or the other in that, or suggest that one party or the other has the better approach necessarily. It's just to re-emphasize the need for them to be working together. A really unhelpful dynamic has come out of these COBRA meetings, the politics of all this, etc. And what we've tried to emphasize is, for businesses causing confusion, or it's causing significant additional cost. And with businesses as tight as they are on cash at the moment, causing additional cost, having to adapt to 4 different sets of regulations and everything that comes with that, is probably the worst thing that we could have. So we're trying to encourage more unity. I think it does, however, take businesses in all 4 nations to stand up and speak up about that as much as possible, if we're going to see it happen. And multi-site organizations working across the 4 nations are probably in a good position to do that. So, you know, and I may mention that when I speak to Clive Selly next, for example, and say, look, can you speak up about this just as we are? Because I think it's really important.
Yeah, well, I certainly at a Scottish level we do. I talk to the Minister and Cabinet Secretary fairly regularly, and had Clive on a call with them last week. I think that, as you say, it's not a question of, you know, London's right, Edinburgh's wrong, or vice versa. You know, different governments will take their own views in terms of releasing lockdown. Things in the best sin does cause confusion. The particular challenge we have in Scotland, and it is affecting work in Edinburgh, is that in the UK, I say the UK government, but really talking about England and Wales, has been very clear that investment in full fibre infrastructure by the industry, so in Edinburgh that's largely ourselves, City Fibre Holdings and Virgin, is critical for the country in the medium to long term, not just today. So in England, that's been encouraged both by government, and as a consequence, the highways authorities are very supportive, whereas in Scotland, it's been a more cautious approach. So unless it's like repairs and urgent repairs and so on and so forth, government here has been supportive of fibre build in what I would call rural or maybe slow broadband speed areas, but much more equivocal about support in more urban areas. And that flows through then to roads officials in the different local authorities in Scotland, taking often completely different views of whether something is permitted or not. And in fact, the biggest problem we have is in Edinburgh, which is quite frustrating because in a city of real knowledge economy, with all the attributes that have been mentioned before, as we come out of this lockdown, the more really capacity and capable digital infrastructure the capital city has, I think is going to be vital. And yet it's the one local authority in Scotland where we're having the most problem building, as are others in the industry. So there's nothing you can do about that. We're dealing with it, but that's the challenges we face compared to other cities. Whereas a comparison in Liverpool, I know that the mayor there, when the lockdown happened, quite logically said, well, as the streets are quiet, come and build as much as you can, which seems logical to me. So it's that contradiction which just is, as you say, it's a hassle, frankly.
Yeah, and no, we certainly see it. And being frank and in this space, the conservatism amongst the Scottish government authorities across a range of areas where businesses have been able to restart in other parts of the United Kingdom, I know has been a great frustration to many, and the follow-on impacts of that have been a great frustration to many. Vis-a-vis infrastructure specifically, the point we've tried to make repeatedly is, at a time when the roads are being used 60 to 70% less than they would be in normal circumstances, at a time when rail passenger numbers are down 90 to 95%, why wouldn't you progress as much work as you possibly could during this period? And why wouldn't you, as governments, allow as much infrastructure work as possible during this period? Because this is like having multiple bank holidays over and over again for you to be able to do it. You should be able to take advantage of it.
I think that's right. And it is harder to, you can't go back to it immediately, because as your resource gets redeployed elsewhere, not just in Scotland, but arguably in the UK, including major subcontracting companies that, all infrastructure companies tend to go to the same group. So, we use companies like Morrison's, as do Scottish Power, and so on. So these guys can disappear down to the Midlands for all we know, and it is harder to get them back. So I've certainly been talking to government about the greater risk of loss in Scotland compared to down south, which, to be fair to the ministers in digital, they absolutely get. But I think there is a degree of over-conservatism, which I think comes out of the SPADs for some reason, which I find it strange that SPADs run governments, but there it seems to be. In Scotland, I think is not good for the country, and certainly not good for the capital city. Anyway, thank you for that.
No, thank you, Brendan. I think that's a really good point, because we're certainly getting some feedback from members across Scotland saying, they are, in terms of construction being open in England, they're losing that opportunity. But also manufacturing businesses, they've now lost contracts to manufacturing companies south of the border because they were unable to fulfill orders. So, that's going to have a huge impact, and that's business unlikely to come back or difficult to get back. So without doubt, I think that's a really good point to raise. Anyone else? Got more questions coming in? We've got to have more questions than this. I'll have to stop picking on people if you don't come in. Well, actually, there's one just come in through the chat. This is all about, hang on, going from Kim, going back to Donald's point, apologies if I missed this, you mentioned possible national insurance holidays. Has there been any other specific detail on incentivising businesses to support businesses' own staffing needs, i.e. linked to restrictions still imposed by government on occupancy? Sorry, this is a very long question. Yeah. I think it was really more Adam making a suggestion about different ways. Adam, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is incredibly complex. What we're getting from UK government right now is the following. The furlough scheme is extraordinarily expensive. We can't maintain it indefinitely. We're going to have to scale it back. So right now we're involved in discussions about what scaling back might look like. For example, being able to bring someone back into the business a couple of days a week, and the furlough scheme topping up the wages that the employer begins to pay again. There's questions around who pays the employer's national insurance and the pension contributions, which were being picked up by the furlough scheme, all of these sorts of things in the mix right now. So I think the scaling back of the furlough scheme and making sure that that is sensitive and flexible is going to be really, really important to retaining some of those jobs. But that's just the first element of that. I think Kim's point about how do you get people to have the confidence to commit to retaining more of those jobs rather than going into redundancies is then the next stage of all of this. And the only thing I can see as being immediately helpful in boosting that confidence is to reduce the government imposed costs of employment. That's why national insurance is an obvious one. I think the Treasury, however, is getting very nervous about its tax take overall, and the big hole that's formed in the public finances. Now, we're trying to encourage them not to be nervous about that, because the hole in the public finances will become structural if businesses simply shed all of these people and there won't be any income tax, national insurance, or anything else coming in for the long term. But I think we're yet to win that particular argument.
Adam, if I can kind of throw something in, obviously last week ONS published the sort of Q1 economic update. So we know that it's been a 2% fall in GDP in the first 3 months.
Yeah.
March alone was almost a 6% fall. I think it's the highest fall since Q4 in 2008. Q2 looks as though it's going to be even worse. Some people projecting as much as 35% fall. We had the chief economist of Royal Bank of Scotland speak to us last week, saying that this is probably the worst recession, or we're facing the worst recession for 300 years.
Yeah.
And that really, how we come out of this is around, sort of 3 key areas. It's about policy, adaptation, and demand.
Yeah.
So, I think you've been covering off some of the policy stuff that, that we're lobbying government to try and get the right policies in place in terms of business support and unlocking the economy. I think the key piece for businesses is this adaptation. How are we going to adapt, and what kind of guidance and support might there be to help businesses? Because I think that's what most businesses are grappling with, is this lack of visibility of what's coming down the line. Right. And how can they start preparing their businesses to adapt to what this new normal might be? In many ways, we should be shaping the new normal. So how do we kind of mobilize the business community to sort of collectively adapt and shape what the future economy can look like?
Well, I think that's going to be at the heart of a lot of what we need to do in terms of our survey work, etc., over the next 6 to 12 months. I think we need to get past the immediate phase of the crisis. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but there are a lot of people talking very volubly about how everything has changed and nothing will ever be the same again, etc., etc. And I think they forget sometimes that after big shocks or after big crises, things do actually snap back towards where they were before to a significant extent. People forget what they went through over a period of time and go back to some established patterns of behavior. So the question for me is, how big is this adaptation going to be? Are we seeing a fundamental revolution, or are we seeing an incremental set of changes? And I think we need to explore with business communities around the UK what they think is going to happen. So we heard early on in this, this is going to be the demise of the commercial property sector because no one's going to want to work in an office ever again. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, because at the moment, people who are going back to offices are going back to offices that can only operate at 30% of capacity. So they'll need more space in those offices, for example. There are lots of things that we don't, have a full view on yet. And we need to start getting feedback on what sorts of adaptations people think will be there for the long term. I think the point about demand, though, is also hugely important. How do you stimulate demand in an economy when individuals, businesses, and the international environment don't show high levels of confidence? We've noticed for the first time in a very long time that the UK public has always been amazing at continuing to spend through just about every uptick and every downturn in the economy. Actually, the UK public is now saving, because they think that times are going to get more difficult in the period ahead. That almost never happens, compared to the Germans. We're positively profligate, aren't we? But we're seeing people pulling back. How do you say to people it's okay to get back out there again and do some things? How do you say to businesses that it's okay to invest? How do you incentivize them to make investments in productivity and adaptation and improvement? Those are some of the challenges that we're going to face over the period ahead. I'm just very cautious about saying, here's what we think must happen right now, because we're still in the foothills of this. We're still in the early days of it. And it feels to me a bit early in order to declaim and say, this is what businesses absolutely need.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, maybe two. I noticed on the chat, Shonag, really nice to have you with us this morning, Shonag. Good to see you. Well, I can't see you. But your question to Adam is, what is the BCC's view on the recently published tariff regime of the UK government? Just taking us slightly off Piece
Yes. So Shoning's brought us to Brexit, I suppose, in a way. Joe mentioned that we hadn't had any talk on Brexit yet, but we can certainly bring it up. So when we had no deal as a prospect a couple of years ago, they published an emergency tariff regime, which actually scared the life out of us to a certain extent. The reason why it was so scary is because it basically didn't protect any of our domestic producers and said our default assumption is that all tariffs go to zero. So that would have been a lot of manufacturing and a lot of others who would have had some very, very significant changes overnight. What they've now done after learning, consulting, and discussing a bit more is publish something that's a lot closer to the existing set of tariffs that we have as a member of the EU. I think there are a few good things about the tariff regime that have been published. One is getting rid of dips or really low-level tariffs, so tariffs that are under 2% and things like that, getting rid of a lot of those. They've also proposed some significant simplifications, so not having, I think the EU tariff code has about 37,000 different lines at the moment, so having a lot less, which will make life easier for a lot of businesses trying to import goods. So I think there are some positives in there, and the fact that in terms of domestic agri-food and manufacturing businesses, they've clocked some of the sensitivities and the fact that you could lose a lot of your UK production if you drop those tariffs too quickly. So I think those are the positives. I think there are a couple of difficulties too, though. There's a big difficulty for any businesses transacting with Northern Ireland, because all of a sudden you have a UK tariff regime that's out of sync with the EU one, and there's a complicated question about how much money might be due if you're shipping stuff from GB to NI and what sorts of tariffs might be imposed. So that's one issue that arises. And the second is that this is not likely to be a stable set of tariffs, because globally right now we're facing a situation where countries are getting protectionist again, and where there might be a situation where you'll see a lot of trade barriers going up and coming down quite frequently. So we've seen it with the US and China, over the last year to 18 months, certainly. And I think we may see a little bit more of that. So I think there'd still be some more tweaks and some more changes to come there. But all of this, to me, rests on one big thing, which is they've got to get to a deal of some sort with the European Union. Otherwise, this tariff schedule applies to trade between GB and the EU 27. And that would be a big overnight and significant change for huge numbers of businesses. And I think the sense that we get from a lot of people around the Chamber network is that if you're coming out of the COVID crisis, which has hit businesses extraordinarily hard, having massive tariffs and a whole new regime on goods between the UK and the EU in 6 months' time bothers a lot of Chamber member businesses and is a big concern, simply because we haven't had to deal with that for 50 years. So there's a lot of complexity in this, and we're talking a lot to the DIT and to others about it. And the last thing that we're doing, just to mention, is we're continuing our work on what we call Chamber Customs, which Liz and the Chamber have been involved in, as have many others. We're trying to do our best as a Chamber network to help businesses navigate some of the customs challenges that may arise in terms of making import and export declarations for the future. So the Chamber network's trying to, if the politics takes things in a certain direction, the Chamber network will be there to support businesses through it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adam. Bang on 10:30, absolutely spot on. So apologies if there's a few more questions. We can pick them up later, but I know everybody's probably need to get back either onto the next Zoom call or back to sort of some kind of work. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I think, as Adam says, we are in the foothills of this. As I think there's the fair old journey to go, and I think you're right. I think we've got to wait and see how things start panning out before we start rushing to adapt and making too many changes too soon. But before I finish, I just wanted to reference, I see that Kieran Smith, one of our members, he said, I don't know whether many of you picked it up this morning, but he sent an email out, and I just wanted to reference it because I think it kind of captures where a lot of people are at the moment. So thank you very much for sending that around, Kieran. If I could just pick up a sentence, I hope you don't mind me using it, but Kieran sort of said, what we do know that in order to be best prepared, we will need our friends and communities continually talking, developing, adapting and supporting each other into stronger partnerships. And I think that's absolutely right. And hopefully, as a Chamber of Commerce, we will continue to provide these forums for people to share their views and to get together, because that's one of the key messages we're getting from our members. Thank you for continuing to run. I think we do about 2 or 3 of these events a week. And we've even started doing a sort of tea time break on a Friday for people to just go on to a Zoom call about 11 with a biscuit and a cup of tea and just chat. Because we're all missing that interaction and that sharing of ideas and experiences, which is really, really important. So we will continue to do that as a chamber. We will continue to engage with British Chambers of Commerce, as you can tell, are doing an enormous amount of job, hugely knowledgeable, and with the kind of collective experiences that we have as a network, it's doing a huge job in shaping the policy and the support going forward. So my big thanks to Adam again, not just for joining us today, but for the enormous work that he and his team are doing and that we are benefiting from. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you at the next one very soon. Have a great day. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.